First of all, thanks for the 2 great talks. Really enjoyed it.
No problem.
My question is for Tony. So you mentioned how you could reliably prefetch JavaScript by doing an XHR, but it was more difficult to prefetch an HTML. So my question is, have you tried using an iframe on the first page in order to get the browser to load the next page's HTML?
So that's a great question. And I got that question last time I gave this talk at Netflix. And no, we haven't, but the person who brought it up said that they were trying that, and they were delighted to learn that you could do other things, because one of the problems with using an iframe is that it actually renders the page. So it can actually cause quite a bit of jank and performance bottlenecks just rendering it. So because it has to render it, I think that's really why we decided not to.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I saw this really interesting talk at Forward.js in last February, given by someone named Mars Jullian. And she said, reusable UI components should have enough state to be useful, don't care about the data, but the component states, i.e. a nav bar keeps track of which tab is active, and you should initialize state, i.e. which tab is selected. Do you still agree with everything you said? Will the real Mars Jullian please stand up?
Yeah, I think I see where you're going with that. Well, so I think in that talk we have kind of different use cases. In a single page application, we're all kind of working in a similar code base. And that talk was really meant for teams that were building reusable UI components to be shared across teams, used in different UIs by multiple use cases and supporting that. So I think having enough state to be useful should be used with caution, and depending on what you're trying to do is my very diplomatic answer to that question. We can talk about it more later.
So Mars, I know you play pool as a recreational activity.
I don't know about that, but
Okay, as a very serious activity. Tony, I'm wondering, what do you do to blow off steam when you're not coding? Are you a rock and roller? Like, what do you do?
I just got Gran Turismo for PlayStation, so I spend a lot of time doing that. And I got one of those racing wheels, so that's pretty sick. I like that. Nothing competitive, though, like Mars.
Nice to see you in the next tournament.
Yeah, so Tony, you mentioned that with the window performance API, you can see the size as transferred over the wire of the different resources. Can you look at that number and figure out what compression the browser and server settled on? And did you investigate Broadly or Zoftly or any of the gzip and better compressors that browsers
That's
have
a
now?
great question. I suppose you could, because you know how big the resource is. I guess you could see how big your clients see it as. That's a great idea. No, we didn't look at that. That's cool.
Hello, I have a question for Mars about when you mentioned walking around the code. Do you have any kind of specific details about how you do that and how you figure out what components are related to each other?
that's a really good question. I like to describe it a lot of the times as following the breadcrumbs, and that's what I like to do a lot when I'm walking around the code. I'll kind of start somewhere. Usually it starts with a bug or trying to figure something out, and I'll start. Well, I actually don't know where I'm starting because I'm just walking around the table, right? So I'll find where functions are being called or sort of what other functions are calling, and sort of find the breadcrumbs until they terminate, if that makes sense. It's a very Alice in Wonderland concept, which is how it feels to walk around a code base that you don't know very well. So it's hard to give concrete steps on how to do that, but that's kind of how I think about it. I hope that answers your question.
Hello, I'm Kevin, and this is a question, I guess, probably more for Tony, but either side, relative to the choice of how to, when you're looking at like cutting out React or like all the extra baggage of rendering and so forth, processing, like choosing between saying for each versus for var in. There's some old school ways of JavaScript that are going to be much faster for doing things that are, not smaller size and so forth. I guess the question is, do you recommend using older structures for coding versus the latest and the greatest, which is nice to look at, but it might not be as performant?
I think that's a really good question. So I don't think we worry too much about it at Netflix for two reasons. One, the JavaScript engines nowadays are really, really good about optimizing code. Like V8 will take care of it, no problem. I don't ever have a concern about using like a map instead of like a for loop. And then two, I just think that the benefits of dev productivity of using functional programming is just way outweighs the downsides, honestly.
This is for Mars. You talked about measuring your A/B tests and showing a substantial improvement. Are you just looking at conversion rate? How many people came to the first page who actually signed up?
That's a good question. I can't speak to that directly, but I would say at Netflix we do look at a variety of measures, specifically in sign-up. So I did mention that we look at the sign-up rate, but also at how qualified our members are. So a sign-up rate could be higher, but members could be abandoning the service earlier. So it really depends on the nature of the test.
Did you guys get some Netflix stickers? They're out there. They're pretty sick. My boss, Ryan, made them.
Go find Ryan.
Yeah.
This one's for Mars. You mentioned a couple of times that you looked at the old code base for features. What did you mean by this in terms of a specification from business versus technical implementation?
Right. So I kind of mentioned we didn't have a very clear spec on sort of what we wanted to. Well, okay, we had specs, but it's also hard to know what features exactly need to be moved over and exactly how they need to be implemented, because some of the domain knowledge of how a particular page needs to work for different user states is really best encapsulated in the code as opposed to the spec. So when it came to trying to figure out what we needed to port over, we would do it a page at a time, and I would just try to honestly to look at how that code behaved and what use cases it was trying to address, which is, like I said, best documented in the code. And so it would just be a matter of looking at the way that page was implemented previously and all of the things that it was trying to do and get an understanding of what different user states and particular states in that flow it was trying to address and find a better way to move them over.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, my question is for Mars. When you said that you re-architected the user flows, was it just the rebranding, or did you change the way you thought about what a user does when they land on the Netflix landing page?
Do you mean between the old bluer flow and
the new one?
That's a great question, actually, and that's kind of what the whole test of the sign-up flow was trying to get at. It wasn't just that we were transitioning over to a single-page application, but we introduced this concept of adding additional context to the sign-up flow for new members so that they understood the steps that they were taking as they went along, which is kind of counterintuitive if you're adding a little bit more steps, more friction. But like I said, we also try to find more qualified members. So we were trying to find that line between less friction or just friction in general and qualified members that make it into the service. So one of the biggest things was not just the rebranding, but also adding that contextual information for new users.
Would be great if you share that in a separate talk.
Okay.
That's interesting.
Thanks.
Question for either of you. What do you guys think about using Node.js, a server, versus serving static files from something like S3, especially for something like a landing page?
Good question. The homepage looks deceptively simple. It's just a landing page, but I don't know. We support something like, I think, 23 languages. Don't quote me on that. So we got localization. In a lot of different markets, we have different prices. We run a bunch of A/B tests. So the complexity is kind of hidden by just the fact that it's just a landing page. So static files really, I don't think, would be quite appropriate. In fact, when we were actually looking, the very initial steps to look to optimize the page performance, we looked at actually just saving the HTML file, storing on CDN, and just serving that directly. But then, as soon as we started thinking about that, we started, okay, well, what are we going to do about different languages, different countries, different prices, different A/B tests? Like, the complexity just balloons. So we kind of need to render stuff at request time, unfortunately.
Round of applause for a great speaker.